Case 1, Luke Wade Truesdell. On June 5, 2024, deputies were sent to a rural property north of Marion in Lynn County, Iowa. The call came from the property owner, Lon Brown, after he was urged to contact emergency services. When law enforcement arrived, they found 4 adults who had been living on the land. 3 were already dead. The 4th was still breathing and was taken by helicopter to a hospital. He died days later. The location was an outbuilding on land owned by Brown. 2 couples had been staying there. One couple lived in a nearby house. The other used the outbuilding and a tent. This was not a remote camp or an abandoned site. It was a working rural property where people moved in and out during the day, where family members visited, and where routine work took place. The 4 victims were Ramondus Lamar Cooper, age 44, and his partner Amanda Sue Parker, age 33, and Brent Anthony Brown, age 34, and his partner Kiana Victoria Ryan, age 26. They were known to family and friends as ordinary people trying to get by. Cooper was a father. Parker was remembered for making people laugh. Brown was known for jokes and an easy laugh. Ryan was young and part of a small, connected circle of friends. That afternoon, Luke Wade Truesdell arrived at the property with his father, Larry Truesdell. They said they were there to work on a boat. Luke Truesdell was in his mid-30s, lived in Marion, and worked in roofing. He had a limited criminal record from years earlier, including a charge for assault. There was no record of close ties between him and the people living on the property. He was a visitor. At different points that day, the 4 residents entered the outbuilding. What happened inside unfolded quickly. When deputies later reconstructed the sequence, they relied on physical evidence, surveillance footage that captured movement outside the structure, and statements made at the scene. The weapon was a 42-inch black metal pipe. It was found nearby. All 4 victims had injuries to the head. Medical examiners later reported that each person had been struck more than once. The injuries were consistent across the victims and showed force applied at close range. Toxicology reports later showed the presence of methamphetamine and related substances in the victims' systems, though examiners stated this did not cause their deaths. When first responders arrived, 3 victims were pronounced dead. Brent Brown was still alive but badly hurt. He was airlifted to a hospital. 2 days later, he died from his injuries. At the scene, Luke Truesdell spoke to people around him, including deputies. Multiple witnesses heard him say that he had struck all of them. His father was present. Video from the property captured Larry Truesdell shouting at his son, accusing him of responsibility. Deputies took Luke Truesdell into custody that day. Investigators from the Lynn County Sheriff's Office took the lead, supported by the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. They secured the scene, collected the pipe, and gathered clothing and other items. The pipe showed blood and biological material. Lab testing later connected it to the victims. A black coating from the pipe was also found in the wounds. Truesdell was tested for drugs shortly after his arrest. The results showed methamphetamine, amphetamine, and THC in his system. In later statements, he claimed that one of the victims had supplied him with drugs in the past. No evidence supported a broader claim of an organized threat or conspiracy. Early in the case, the focus remained on Truesdell. He had been present. He had spoken at the scene The physical evidence pointed in his direction. Still, the defense later raised questions about the investigation. They pointed to the presence of Larry Truesdell at the scene and argued that some items connected to him were not fully examined. They claimed investigators fixed on one suspect too quickly. Some of Truesdell's statements were not used at trial. A judge ruled that parts of an interview should be excluded because proper warnings were not given at the time. Other statements, including remarks made at the scene, were allowed. A mental health evaluation was ordered during pre-trial proceedings. In August 2024, Truesdell was found able to stand trial. No public diagnosis was entered into the record. The case moved forward. The deaths drew wide attention. Lynn County had not seen a case involving 4 homicide victims at once. Media coverage focused on the setting, the number of victims, and the violence involved. Motions were filed asking that the trial be moved due to pretrial coverage. The court denied those requests. Trial began in November 2025. Jurors heard from deputies, forensic experts, and medical examiners. Surveillance footage showed movements around the outbuilding, but did not capture the attacks themselves. The pipe was introduced as evidence. Experts explained the injuries and how they matched the weapon. Family members of the victims sat through testimony and photographs. The defense emphasized gaps they said remained. They questioned why some items linked to Larry Truesdell were not tested. They raised the issue of drug use and argued it affected intent. They also pointed to the lack of video showing the assaults. The state argued that the sequence of events, the physical evidence, and Truesdell's own words established responsibility beyond doubt. They described the attacks as an ambush that occurred as the victims entered the outbuilding one by one. On November 17, 2025, the jury returned its verdicts. Luke Wade Truesdell was found guilty of first-degree murder for the deaths of Kiana Ryan, Amanda Parker, and Brent Brown. He was found guilty of second-degree murder for the death of Ramondis Cooper. Under Iowa law, the first-degree convictions carry mandatory life sentences with no parole. Sentencing was scheduled for early 2026. Family members reacted quietly in court. Some cried, others sat still. Outside the courtroom, relatives spoke about who the victims had been before June 5th. They talked about children who would grow up without parents, and about days that now marked loss instead of routine. In the months after the verdict, the community held remembrances. Obituaries and tributes focused on everyday traits: laughter, generosity, shared work, and plans that would not be carried out. The property itself returned to silence. And the case raised questions that went beyond one man's actions. It forced scrutiny of how quickly drug use, access, and proximity can turn deadly, and how warning signs tied to substance abuse often go unresolved until after harm occurs. It also tested confidence in rural safety, where people expect familiarity to act as protection. Luke Wade Truesdell now waits for sentencing. The victims' families move forward without answers that could restore what was lost. The legal process reached a conclusion. The consequences remain. Where did accountability fail first? Case 2. Jerry Lynn Burns. In the early hours of December 20th, 1979, a Cedar Rapids police officer walking the parking lot at Westdale Mall found a car that did not belong where it sat. Inside was the body of an 18-year-old woman. She had been stabbed many times. The vehicle was her family's Buick Electra. It was parked near a department store entrance that had been busy only hours earlier. The victim was Michelle Marie Martinko. She was a senior at John F. Kennedy High School. Earlier that evening, she had attended a school choir banquet. Afterwards, she drove to the mall to pick up a coat she had left behind while shopping. Friends saw her there around 6:30 that night. She never made it home. Cedar Rapids at the time was a mid-sized Iowa city where families shopped late in December without much concern. The mall was a routine stop. Teenagers gathered there after school events. Parking lots were open and well lit. There was no expectation that a short errand could end in violence. Michelle Martinko was known as a strong student and an active teenager. She was involved in choir, theater, and baton twirling. She planned to study interior design at Iowa State University. Her parents described her as driven and kind. She was the younger of 2 daughters. Her family reported her missing shortly after 2 a.m. when she did not return home. When officers searched the parking lot, they found her in the driver's seat. There were signs she had fought back. The medical examiner later reported dozens of stab wounds to her face and chest, as well as injuries to her hands. The cause of death was blood loss from a wound to the heart. The scene showed no sign of theft. Her purse was present. Purchases were untouched. There was no indication of a sexual assault. Investigators believed the attack happened quickly and without warning. They also believed the person who killed her had been injured. Blood at the scene did not belong to the victim. From the start, the case presented limits. There were no clear witnesses, no weapon was found, fingerprints were not recovered. What investigators did have was blood from the attacker on Michelle's clothing and on the gear shift inside the car. That blood became the central piece of evidence for the next 4 decades. Early efforts focused on people known to Michelle. Former boyfriends were interviewed. Friends were questioned. Rumors circulated about someone following her. None of those leads held. Over time, the case grew cold. Files were reviewed again and again, but no arrest followed. Michelle's parents lived the rest of their lives without answers. Her father died in 1995. Her mother died in 1998. For years, the case stood as one of Cedar Rapids' most painful unsolved killings. New investigators inherited the file. Each knew the evidence remained, waiting for a method that did not yet exist. By the early 2000s, a DNA profile had been developed from the blood left by the attacker. It did not match anyone in law enforcement databases. The profile was preserved. The case remained open. In 2018, a change came from outside the traditional system. Advances in genetic genealogy allowed investigators to compare crime scene DNA to profiles submitted by the public to online genealogy services. With the help of Parabon Nanolabs and state investigators, Cedar Rapids police began building family trees from partial matches. The work took months. The DNA did not identify a suspect directly. Instead, it pointed to relatives. Investigators narrowed the possibilities to 3 brothers from eastern Iowa. Surveillance followed. Discarded items were collected. In December 2018, officers retrieved a drinking straw from a trash container after one of the brothers, Jerry Lynn Burns, used it at a restaurant. The DNA on the straw matched the blood from Michelle Martinko's clothing and car. Burns was arrested on December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years after the night Michelle was killed. He was 65 years old. At the time of the crime, he had been 25. Burns had lived an ordinary life in the years between. He grew up in Manchester, Iowa. He ran a powder coating business. He married and raised children. There was no public record of violent crime tied to him. When investigators interviewed him, he denied knowing Michelle or being involved in her death. He offered no explanation for the DNA. The arrest brought national attention. Many saw it as proof that long-dormant cases could still reach resolution. Others raised concerns about privacy and the use of genealogy databases. Those debates unfolded alongside preparations for trial. Burns's case was moved to Scott County due to publicity. At trial, jurors heard from forensic experts who explained how the DNA profile had been preserved and matched. They saw photographs from the crime scene. They watched a video of Burns' interview where he remained calm and denied involvement. The defense focused on the passage of time. They questioned how evidence had been stored decades earlier. They suggested the possibility of contamination or transfer. They emphasized the lack of a known link between Burns and the victim. The state relied on the DNA. Prosecutors argued that there was no reasonable explanation for the presence of Burns's blood at the scene. They presented the stabbing as intentional and severe, carried out by a stranger who left Michelle to die in her car. After about 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on February 24, 2020. Burns was convicted of first-degree murder. At sentencing later that year, the court imposed a life sentence. Iowa law required it. Family members of Michelle spoke about the decades spent without answers. They described birthdays and holidays marked by absence. They said justice had come too late for Michelle's parents, but it had come all the same. Burns appealed his conviction. He argued that collecting DNA from a discarded straw violated his rights. The Iowa Supreme Court rejected that claim in 2023, holding that the straw had been abandoned property. The conviction stood. For Cedar Rapids, the case closed a chapter that had lasted nearly half a century. It also opened new questions about how many other cases might still depend on evidence already sitting in storage, waiting for the right tool. Michelle Martinko's name is now spoken alongside words like resolution and accountability. Yet the outcome does not change what happened in that parking lot or the years when her family lived without answers. Was justice delayed here, or was it limited by time from the start? Case 3. Shanna Elizabeth Golyar. November 2012, Carilea Farver left an apartment in Omaha after spending the night with a man she had recently begun dating. She told him she was heading to work. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. Within hours, messages began appearing from her phone that would convince nearly everyone around her that she was still alive. For more than 4 years, those messages shaped the entire case. Carrie Farver was 37 years old. She lived in Macedonia, Iowa, and worked in information technology. She was the mother of a teenage son and stayed in close contact with her family, especially her mother. She did not have a history of disappearing or cutting off contact. Her routine was stable. Her responsibilities were clear. The man she had been seeing, Dave Krupa, lived in Omaha. Their relationship was casual and brief. Around the same time, he was also seeing Shanna Elizabeth Golyar, who used the name Liz. Krupa had told both women that he was not seeking a committed relationship. Both had said they understood. On the morning of November 13, 2012, Krupa received a message from Kari that read like a sudden shift. The tone changed quickly. Over the next days and weeks, messages became hostile and threatening. They claimed she was watching him. They claimed she had keys. They claimed she would not stop. At the same time, Carrie's mother began receiving messages from her daughter's phone. The messages said Carrie had moved away for work. They said she was fine. They said she did not want contact. Carrie did not pick up her son. She missed work. She missed family events. Yet the messages continued. Because of those messages, law enforcement initially treated Carrie as alive and responsible for the harassment. The focus stayed there for years. During that time, Golyar positioned herself as another target. She reported harassment. In 2013, her house caught fire. Pets inside were killed. Messages appeared from Carrie's phone taking responsibility. In 2015, Golyar reported being shot in the leg. She blamed Carrie again. Investigators later determined the wound was self-inflicted. The volume of communication was extreme. Tens of thousands of texts and emails were sent, not just to Krupa, but to his friends, family members, and employers. The messages tracked movements. They referenced private moments. They created the impression that Carrie Farver was active, angry, and escalating. Digital evidence kept the narrative in place. In 2015, investigators in Iowa began to question the foundation of the case. Two law enforcement officers took opposing approaches. One assumed Carrie was alive. The other worked under the assumption that she was not. That shift changed everything. A cyber investigator began tracing the origin of the messages. The work was slow and technical. IP addresses were compared. Devices were examined. Patterns emerged. The messages were not coming from Carrie Farver. They were coming from devices linked to Shanna Golyar. Investigators recovered data from memory cards and old phones. Among the files was a photograph of a human foot in advanced decay. The foot bore a tattoo consistent with one Carrie was known to have. There was no indication the image had been shared by anyone else. Police also located Carrie's Ford Explorer. Inside was blood. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to her. There was no body. But the evidence showed that Carrie had not left voluntarily, and that someone had taken deliberate steps to keep others from realizing she was gone. Golyar was arrested in December 2016. She denied involvement. She maintained that Carrie was alive and responsible for the harassment. She chose a bench trial rather than a jury. At trial, the court reviewed years of digital records. Thousands of messages were linked to Golyar's devices. Fake accounts were traced back to her. Emails she had sent while posing as other people were introduced. Some of those emails described acts of violence against Carrie in detail. They were attempts to place blame elsewhere. The state argued that Carrie Farver had been killed shortly after leaving Krupa's apartment in 2012. And they argued the impersonation campaign was a sustained effort to hide that fact and control the narrative. The defense argued there was no body, no weapon, and no eyewitness. They challenged whether the evidence proved death beyond doubt. The judge rejected that position. In August 2017, Shanna Golyar was found guilty of first-degree murder and second-degree arson. She was sentenced to life in prison plus additional consecutive time. The court stated clearly that Carrie Farver did not disappear by choice. For Carrie's family, the verdict brought an answer, but not recovery. Her mother had spent years receiving messages she believed came from her daughter. Those messages are now understood as part of the harm. Carrie's son grew up without her. There is no burial site. There was no chance to say goodbye. This case raised questions that extend beyond one person's actions. It showed how digital systems can delay recognition of harm. It showed how assumptions shape investigations. It showed how long a false narrative can hold if it fits what people expect to see. There was no recovery of remains. There was no confession. There was no final explanation of how Carrie Farver died. The court ruled on what could be proven. The rest remains unresolved. Was accountability achieved here? Or did the system arrive only after years of preventable harm? Case 4. Shawn Michael Bentler. The first sound preserved in this case is not gunfire. It is a teenager asking for help. At approximately 3:38 a.m. on October 14, 2006, emergency dispatch in Van Buren County received a call from a rural home near Bonaparte, Iowa. A young girl spoke quickly. She said her brother was about to do something. In the background, an adult woman could be heard pleading. The caller used a name, then a gunshot was heard. The call ended abruptly. A second call from the same house never connected. When deputies arrived minutes later, 5 people were dead. The Bentler family lived on a well-kept property outside town. Michael Bentler was 53 years old and owned a successful grain elevator and lumber business. His wife, Sandra, was 47 and managed the household. Their 3 daughters, Shanna, Shelby, and Shane, were teenagers active in school and community life. The family attended church and had a strong local reputation. There were no prior law enforcement calls to the home. Shawn Michael Bentler was the eldest child. He was 22 years old and no longer lived there. He had moved to Quincy, Illinois, after leaving college and struggled to maintain steady employment. Court records later showed he was behind on child support for 2 young daughters from previous relationships. His parents had continued to provide financial help, though tensions had grown. On the night of the killings, Shawn drove from Quincy to his parents' house. The trip took just over an hour. There was no forced entry. He knew the layout. He knew where each family member slept. The weapon used was a .22 caliber rifle. Sandra Bentler was confronted first. Her voice was heard on the emergency call asking her son to stop. She was shot multiple times. One of the daughters placed the call while hiding. She was shot through the phone handset. The other daughters were located in the separate bedrooms. Michael Bentler was shot as well. The shootings occurred in different rooms. The medical findings later confirmed multiple gunshot wounds to the head for each victim. After leaving the house, Shawn returned to Illinois. He was arrested later that morning on an unrelated warrant. When informed that his family members were dead, officers noted little reaction. Investigators focused on verifiable evidence. The 911 call identified Shawn by name. His cell phone was found inside the home. Blood belonging to Sandra Bentler was later found on socks Shawn was wearing at the time of arrest. The rifle used in the killings was recovered nearby. There was no indication of an intruder. No property was missing. Nothing suggested a struggle beyond the shootings themselves. Shawn denied involvement. He said he had not been at the house. He suggested someone else could have committed the killings. Investigators compared his account to travel times, phone records, and physical evidence. The timeline supported his presence. The case moved to court in 2007. Shawn waived his right to a jury trial. A judge heard the evidence and determined the verdict. One of the most critical pieces of evidence was the emergency call. The recording captured the voices of the victims in real time. Family members left the courtroom when it was played. The judge noted the clarity of the identification. The defense argued the lighting was poor and that stress could cause misidentification. They argued there was no direct eyewitness placing Shawn inside the home at the moment of each shooting. They questioned whether investigators focused too narrowly on one suspect, and the court rejected those arguments. The judge found Shawn Bentler guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. At sentencing, the court imposed 5 life sentences. 4 were ordered to run together. 1, related to the killing of Sandra Bentler, was ordered to run consecutively. The court cited the evidence captured on the emergency call as a factor. During sentencing, extended family members spoke. They described the loss of parents, sisters, nieces, and cousins. Photographs of the girls were displayed. There were no statements minimizing responsibility or searching for explanation. The focus remained on the outcome. From a legal standpoint, motive was addressed cautiously. The court did not rely on speculation about mental state. Testimony showed Shawn had discussed financial stress and inheritance with others before the killings. And the judge described the acts as planned and intentional. Appeals followed. Shawn challenged the admission of evidence and the sufficiency of proof. Appellate courts reviewed the record and upheld the convictions. They found the evidence adequate and the proceedings proper. The case forced the community to confront the reality of violence occurring without prior warning. There were no protection orders, no reported threats, no calls for help before that night. The system had no opportunity to intervene earlier. The emergency call did not prevent the deaths. It documented them. Schools in the area provided counseling. Churches held services. The home was eventually vacated. The family was buried together in the local cemetery, their headstones placed side by side. From an institutional perspective, and the response was swift once the call was received. Deputies arrived quickly. The scene was secured. Evidence was collected. The case moved through court without procedural delay. What the system could not address was prevention. Family conflict and financial strain were not crimes. They did not meet thresholds for intervention. The violence occurred inside a private space, carried out by someone who had unrestricted access. 5 people died before sunrise. 3 of them were children. The person responsible was their brother and son. The court resolved the question of guilt. It imposed the most severe penalty available. It did not provide an answer to how warning signs inside families are identified before violence occurs. The record shows what happened, when it happened, and who was responsible. It does not show a point where the system could have acted earlier without violating its own limits. Where should accountability begin when harm unfolds entirely inside a home? Case 5, Stephen Frank Sueppel. 2 locations define this case within the span of 15 minutes. A quiet residential street and a stretch of interstate highway. Shortly after 6:30 a.m. on March 24, 2008, emergency dispatch in Iowa City received a brief phone call. The caller did not give a name. He told police to go immediately to a house on Barrington Road. The line disconnected. Moments later, State Patrol reported a minivan collision on Interstate 80. The vehicle had struck a concrete support and caught fire. The driver was pronounced dead at the scene. When officers entered the Barrington Roadhouse, they found 5 people dead inside. Stephen Sueppel was 42 years old. He worked as a senior officer at a local bank and held responsibility for financial oversight. He had lived in Iowa City most of his life and came from a family with deep ties to the area. His wife, Sueppel, was also 42. She had previously worked as a teacher and was raising their 4 children at home. The children were adopted from South Korea and ranged in age from 3 to 10. The family was active in their church and school community. Friends described regular routines and steady involvement. There had been no prior calls to law enforcement related to the home, no reports of domestic disputes, no known history of violence. The night before the deaths, the family attended Easter Mass together. Later that evening, a family friend stopped by the house around 8 p.m. Nothing unusual was observed. Stephen was present. At least one of the children was awake. No concerns were reported. After 11:30 p.m., Stephen left a series of voicemail messages for relatives and colleagues. The messages were apologetic but did not describe any specific action. Investigators later recovered a handwritten note left inside the house. The note described events Stephen claimed had taken place and included expressions of regret. Medical examinations established that Cheryl and the 4 children died from multiple blunt force injuries. 2 aluminum baseball bats were recovered from inside the home. There were no signs of forced entry. The injuries were consistent with repeated strikes. The manner of death for all 5 was ruled homicide. Investigators reconstructed the sequence of events using the note, phone records, and physical evidence. Stephen first attempted to end his own life by running a vehicle in the garage. That attempt failed. He then attacked his wife and children inside the house. Afterward, he attempted to enter the Iowa River but did not succeed. He returned to his vehicle, placed the anonymous emergency call, and drove onto the interstate, where he caused the fatal crash. Dental records confirmed that Stephen was the driver of the minivan. Because Stephen died at the scene, there was no arrest and no criminal trial for the killings. The case was closed as a multiple homicide followed by suicide. The question that remained was why. Federal court records provided relevant context. Weeks earlier, Stephen had been charged with embezzlement and money laundering related to his work at the bank. Investigators alleged he had taken more than $500,000 over several years. He had pleaded not guilty. A trial was pending. Conviction would likely have resulted in prison time and public disclosure. There was no evidence that Cheryl or the children were involved in or aware of the alleged financial crimes. No evidence suggested they were targets of investigation. Friends and family later stated they had seen no indication that Stephen posed a threat to them or himself. Law enforcement avoided speculation. Public statements focused on what could be established: the note, the timeline, the phone calls, and the physical findings. Officers stated plainly that Stephen was the only person who knew why the acts were committed. The community response was immediate and restrained. Iowa City schools provided counseling services. Church services were filled beyond capacity. Neighbors placed flowers and notes near the home. The street was closed for days during the investigation. A joint funeral service was held for all 6 family members. The decision to include Stephen prompted discussion but was supported by relatives. 6 caskets were present. The focus of the service remained on the children. From an institutional standpoint, the response followed established procedure. Police responded promptly to both locations. The house was secured, evidence was documented, autopsies were completed, findings were released. There were no claims of investigative failure or misconduct. The financial case against Stephen ended with his death. The charges were dismissed. The bank later sought repayment through civil proceedings against the estate. Those actions did not involve criminal accountability for the deaths. This case exposed a gap the system does not address easily. Financial crimes are investigated separately from family welfare. Court filings, indictments, and pretrial motions occur without automatic review of potential risk to others. No mechanism existed to evaluate whether pressure from pending charges posed danger inside the household. No warning was issued. No intervention was triggered. There were no threats reported. No statements made to authorities. No behavior that met a legal threshold for action. 5 people were killed inside a home that had never required police response. 4 of them were children whose lives depended entirely on the adults around them. The justice system resolved the financial case by default. It did not adjudicate the homicides because the person responsible removed himself from the process. The facts establish responsibility. They do not establish prevention. This case is often cited because it defies familiar warning patterns. There was no history of violence, no escalation documented through calls or reports. The act occurred after a public religious service and before dawn. The law can describe what happened and who did it. It cannot assign accountability to systems that were never designed to see it coming. When the person responsible controls the final narrative and exits the process entirely, where does accountability end? Case 6. Cristhian, Bahena, Rivera. The search began before there was a crime scene. On a summer evening in July 2018, people in Brooklyn, Iowa noticed something ordinary had failed to happen. Molly Tibbetts did not return home from her run. She had a routine. She told people where she was going. She checked in. That night she didn't. By the next morning, the concern was no longer private. It became collective. Brooklyn is a small town in Poweshiek County. It sits along farm roads and gravel lanes, a place where daily movement is noticed, because there isn't much of it. Residents knew Molly. She had grown up there. Her parents lived there. She was home for the summer while attending the University of Iowa. She worked at a children's hospital and ran most evenings on the same routes. When she didn't come back, her family reported her missing. At first, there was no assumption of violence. Missing person cases often start that way. Friends checked messages. Neighbors retraced paths. Deputies canvassed roads. Within hours, state investigators were involved, then federal agents, then volunteers. The search expanded rapidly. Fields were walked, ditches were checked, drones were deployed. Posters went up across Iowa. For weeks, there was no answer. Molly Tibbetts was 20 years old. She studied psychology. She talked openly about working with children. People described her as outgoing and focused. There was no record of conflict, threats, or unstable behavior. She had no reason to leave without notice. Digital records became the primary source of information. Phone data showed when she left the house. Fitness data showed her pace. Social media activity stopped mid-evening. Video from nearby homes showed a black Chevrolet Malibu driving through the area around the time of her run. The vehicle appeared more than once. It slowed. It turned around. It followed the same stretch of road. Investigators focused on the car, and they identified it through a series of narrow leads: doorbell cameras, farm equipment footage, license plate fragments. Eventually, they traced the vehicle to a dairy farm worker who lived in the area under the name John Budd. His real name was Cristhian Bahena Rivera. Rivera was 24 years old. He had lived in Iowa for several years and worked long hours on a dairy farm. He had a partner and a young child. There was no record of violent charges. He had not drawn attention to himself. On August 20th, 2018, investigators asked Rivera to come in for an interview. He agreed. The conversation lasted many hours. At first, he denied involvement. He said he saw Molly while driving but did not stop. He said he circled because he was lost. Over time, his account changed. Rivera told investigators he approached Molly while driving. He said there was an argument. He claimed he panicked. He said he attacked her and placed her body in the trunk of his car. He then led investigators to a cornfield near Guernsey. On August 21st, after more than a month of searching, Molly Tibbetts was found. Her body was concealed among rows of corn. Her running shoes were visible. Medical findings later confirmed she died from multiple stab wounds. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Rivera was arrested that day. The investigation did not end with the confession. Investigators tested physical evidence. Blood matching Molly was found in the trunk of Rivera's car. Surveillance video placed his vehicle along her route. Digital data supported the timeline. The case moved quickly to prosecution. From the start, the public attention was intense. The scale of the search, the length of time, and the age of the victim drew national coverage. Political figures commented. Immigration status became part of public discussion. Molly's family asked repeatedly that the focus remain on violence and accountability, not policy arguments. At trial, Rivera changed his story again. He testified that two masked men forced him to help. He claimed he was threatened and acted under fear. He said his earlier confession was false. The jury heard both versions. The court examined whether the confession was voluntary. Portions of the interview conducted before formal warnings were excluded. The rest was admitted. Investigators testified about Rivera's demeanor and statements. The defense raised concerns about language barriers and pressure. The judge ruled the evidence admissible. Forensic evidence was central. The presence of Molly's blood in the trunk required explanation. No evidence supported the existence of other attackers. No other suspects were identified despite extensive review. The jury deliberated for several days. In May 2021, Cristhian Bahena Rivera was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory life in prison. At sentencing, Molly's parents spoke. They described the loss in clear terms. They did not call for public anger. They did not ask for political response. They focused on what was taken from their family. The judge addressed Rivera directly. The court stated that Molly's death was the result of his actions alone. Appeals followed. Rivera argued that his confession was coerced and that alternative suspects were not fully explored. The appellate courts reviewed the record and upheld the conviction. They found the evidence sufficient and the trial fair. From a system perspective, the response was extensive. Law enforcement resources were deployed at scale. Technology was used effectively. The case moved from disappearance to arrest, with measurable steps at each stage. There were also limits. Molly was not protected by routine. She was not warned of a threat. There was no prior report that would have justified intervention. The system responded only after she was gone. The aftermath continues to shape discussion in Iowa. Runners changed habits. Families spoke about safety. Communities examined how strangers move through shared spaces. For Molly's family, the legal outcome did not restore what was lost. It did not shorten the search. It did not answer every question about why this happened on an ordinary road in a familiar place. The court delivered judgment. The evidence was tested. The sentence was imposed. What remains is a broader question that the legal process cannot resolve. Where did accountability begin when prevention was never possible? Case 7. Dustin Lee Honken and Angela Jane Johnson. What failed first in this case was not an investigation. It was the protection of witnesses. By mid-1993, federal drug charges were already moving through the courts in northern Iowa. Those charges depended on people who agreed to cooperate. Some of those people disappeared before they could testify again. At the time, the system did not yet understand why. Dustin Lee Honken was operating a methamphetamine business centered around Mason City. He was not a marginal figure. He manufactured and distributed at scale. He controlled access. He enforced loyalty. When one of his associates began working with law enforcement, Honken understood the risk clearly. Gregory Nicholson was 34 years old. He had been arrested on drug charges and agreed to cooperate. He testified before a grand jury. His cooperation threatened Honken's freedom and his operation. The court knew Nicholson was a witness. Protection beyond standard procedures was limited. Lori Duncan was a single mother. She worked full-time and raised 2 daughters, Candace, 10, and Amber, 6. Nicholson had been staying at her home while claiming he was in treatment. Lori did not know the scope of his involvement with Honken. Her children had no connection to the drug case at all. Angela Jane Johnson was Honken's partner. She maintained contact with Nicholson and others. Records later showed she acted as the point of access. She arranged meetings. She delivered messages. Her role was active. On July 25, 1993, Johnson contacted Nicholson and told him she could help resolve his problems with Honken. Nicholson believed it was an opportunity to settle the conflict. He brought Lori and her 2 daughters with him. They did not return. For years, the disappearance was treated as unresolved. A note left behind suggested Nicholson had left voluntarily. With no bodies and no witnesses, the original drug case collapsed. Charges against Honken were dismissed. The system moved on without answers. It should not have. On November 5, 1993, Terry DeGius disappeared. He was 32 years old and also connected to Honken's drug operation. He had previously dated Johnson. Like Nicholson, he had knowledge that could harm Honken's case. He was lured to a meeting and never seen again. 5 people were gone. 2 of them were children. The disappearances were linked by pattern, not proof. Years passed. Honken continued serving a sentence on unrelated drug charges. The murders remained unsolved. The turning point came from inside a jail. While incarcerated, Johnson spoke to another inmate. She provided hand-drawn maps. She described burial locations. That information was passed to authorities. In 2000, investigators searched wooded land in Cerro Gordo County. They found a shallow grave. Inside were 4 bodies: Gregory Nicholson, Lori Duncan, Candace Duncan, Amber Duncan. All had been shot. The adults had been restrained. The children had been killed where they lay. A separate grave held the remains of Terry DeGius. His injuries showed both blunt force and gunshot trauma. The case reopened immediately. Investigators reconstructed what had happened. Johnson had arranged the meetings. Honken carried out the killings. The motive was consistent across all 5 deaths: elimination of witnesses. The evidence came from multiple sources. Physical recovery confirmed homicide. Former associates testified about Honken's statements. Inmates described detailed admissions. Johnson's maps matched the burial sites. A babysitter testified that Honken and Johnson borrowed her vehicle the night of the first killings and later returned it with a firearm present. Honken denied responsibility. He claimed others were involved. He pointed to lack of direct forensic links tying him to the weapons. The court allowed the jury to hear all sides. This was a federal case. The charges included murder committed to obstruct justice in furtherance of a continuing criminal enterprise. The victims were witnesses or connected to witnesses. The law treated that distinction seriously. At trial in 2004, jurors heard evidence about the killings of children. They heard testimony describing how the adults were restrained and how the children were shot. There was no dispute that the children posed no threat and had no involvement in criminal activity. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Sentencing followed in 2005. The court imposed the most severe penalty allowed under federal law at that time for the murders of the children. For the adult victims, the court imposed sentences that ensured Honken would never be released. Angela Johnson was also convicted. Her initial sentence matched Honken's in severity. Years later, appellate courts reduced her sentence based on legal standards applied to accomplices. She remains incarcerated for life. Honken remained on death row for 15 years. During that time, appeals were filed and denied. The convictions were upheld. The findings of fact were reviewed repeatedly. Courts found no reversible error that altered the outcome. On July 17, 2020, Dustin Honken was executed by the federal government. Families of the victims attended. Some described the passage of time as another burden. The children had been gone for decades. Justice, when it arrived, did not arrive quickly. This case forced an examination of witness protection failures. Nicholson was known to be cooperating. The risk was known, the response was limited. Lori Duncan and her children were never identified as at risk, even though Nicholson was living in their home. No formal protection was provided. No relocation occurred. No warning reached Lori that association alone carried danger. The murders stopped testimony. They ended a federal case. For years, that outcome benefited the person responsible. The later convictions corrected the record, or they did not undo the cost. This case is studied not only for its brutality, but for what it exposed about how systems protect people who assist them. Cooperation with law enforcement carries risk. The burden of that risk should not fall on families who have no connection to the crime. 5 people died because information threatened a criminal enterprise. 2 of them were children whose only connection was proximity. The law eventually responded with force. It did not respond in time. Where did accountability fail first? With the killer, or with the system that knew the danger and did not act? Case 8. Seth Andrew Techel. The call came from inside the house. Early on May 26, 2012, a young man phoned emergency dispatch from a rural trailer near Agency, Iowa. He was crying. He said his wife had been shot. He said he had been in the shower. He said, "Someone broke in and fired a gun." He asked for help. Responding deputies found Lisa Marie Caldwell Techel in bed. She was 23 years old. She was pregnant, about 17 weeks along. She had been shot once with a shotgun. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing in the home appeared disturbed. Seth Andrew Techel was Lisa's husband. They had married the previous fall after years of dating that began in high school. Both worked in the criminal justice field. Lisa was a jailer and reserve deputy. Seth worked as a jailer and volunteered as a firefighter. In a small community, both were known. Their families were known too. For the first hours, focused on the account Seth gave. He said he heard a loud noise while showering. He said he rushed out and found Lisa injured. He said an intruder must have entered and left without taking anything. Investigators recorded the statement and began checking the scene. The physical evidence raised questions. Doors and windows were intact. The bedroom showed no signs of a struggle. The shot appeared precise. No shell was found in the room. A shotgun owned by the family was not immediately accounted for. Lisa's death was ruled a homicide. The pregnancy was also counted as a separate victim under state law. Investigators expanded the scope. They reviewed phone records. They interviewed co-workers. They learned Seth had been involved in a relationship outside his marriage. Messages and images exchanged with a co-worker showed planning and secrecy. Some messages discussed a future without Lisa. That information shifted the focus. A neighbor with a history of disputes was considered early. He cooperated. His movements were verified. He was later ruled out. Attention returned to the home and the people inside it. The missing shotgun was located the next day in tall grass north of the trailer, placed away from the direction Seth claimed an intruder fled. Testing linked the weapon to the fatal wound. The gun belonged to the household. Seth was arrested. The case did not resolve quickly. It moved through 3 jury trials over 2 years. The first ended without a verdict. The second ended the same way. Each time, jurors weighed a case built on timing, relationships, and physical findings rather than direct eyewitness proof. Between trials, new information surfaced. Investigators learned Lisa had also been involved in a relationship outside the marriage. The defense argued that this introduced alternate motives and suspects. The court allowed the information to be presented in the third trial. The third jury heard a fuller record. They heard about the affair Seth was having and the messages that suggested an intent to leave his marriage. They heard from the co-worker who described secrecy and plans. They heard from investigators about the placement of the weapon and the absence of forced entry. They heard the emergency call. They also heard about investigative gaps. The initial inventory of firearms had missed the shotgun. Some testing occurred later than it should have. The defense argued these failures created doubt. The jury reached a verdict. Seth Techel was found guilty of first-degree murder and of causing the death of the unborn child. He was sentenced to a life term for the murder and an additional term for the pregnancy loss, to be served consecutively. At sentencing, Lisa's family spoke directly to Seth. They described welcoming him into their home and trusting him as a husband and future father. They described learning the details of the case in public over years while waiting for a final outcome. Seth declined to speak. Appeals followed. The defense argued that Late disclosure of evidence affected fairness and that the case relied too heavily on inference. Appellate courts reviewed the record and upheld the convictions. They found the jury had sufficient evidence to reach its conclusion. From an institutional view, the case exposed tension points. Small agencies handle scenes involving people who work within the same system. Familiarity can slow suspicion. Early assumptions can shape evidence collection. Corrections made later are rarely clean. The length of the process also had consequences. 3 trials kept the case open for families in the community. Each mistrial reopened wounds. Each delay extended uncertainty. For some residents, doubt lingered. The absence of a witness to the shooting left room for debate. For others, the total record was decisive. The court ruled on the evidence presented, not on certainty beyond all doubt. Lisa Techel was preparing for motherhood and continuing a career in public service. Her child had a name chosen. Those facts were not disputed. The case stands as an example of how intimate crimes are investigated and judged. It shows how motive can be established through communication. It shows how physical scenes are interpreted when only 2 people are present and 1 survives. It shows how legal outcomes can remain contested even after final rulings. The system delivered a verdict after repeated review. It did not deliver a resolution that satisfied everyone. What should have happened differently when the first account came from the only person left alive? Case 9, Willard Noble Chaden Miller and Jeremy Everett Goodale. The planning did not happen in secret places. It happened in messages. During the fall semester of 2021, a Spanish teacher in Fairfield, Iowa, followed the same routine she had kept for years. After school, she walked through a nearby park. Students saw her pass the same trails. Neighbors recognized her schedule. Nothing about it was hidden. Nohema Graber was 66 years old. She taught Spanish at Fairfield High School and had done so for nearly a decade. She was known to students as steady and patient. She had immigrated to the United States from Mexico years earlier and remained active in her church and local community. Teaching was her profession. Walking was her habit. 2 of her students noticed that habit and used it. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale were both 16. They attended the same high school where Graber taught. Miller had been struggling in her class. A failing grade threatened his academic plans. Records later showed resentment focused narrowly on that outcome. Goodale was a friend who agreed to help. The 2 began discussing a plan. Messages later recovered showed they watched Graber's routine. They selected a location in Chautauqua Park. They talked about timing, tools, and escape. The plan developed over roughly 2 weeks. On November 2, 2021, Graber left the school building and headed toward the park, as she had many times before. She did not return home. Family members reported her missing the next day. Law enforcement initially treated the case as a disappearance. Officers searched the park. Within hours, they found her body concealed off the trail. It had been covered with a tarp, railroad ties, and a wheelbarrow. The cause of death was blunt force injury to the head. Investigators recovered a baseball bat later linked to Miller. Blood-stained clothing was found during searches of the teenagers' homes. The investigation moved quickly. Classmates provided screenshots of private messages. In those messages, Goodale described the planning, the attack, and the steps taken afterward. Surveillance footage showed Graber's van leaving the park with 2 people inside. When questioned, Miller first claimed that unknown assailants forced him to help. That account changed. Goodale gave a detailed statement describing the plan and his role. Both were arrested within days. Because of their ages, the court had to decide how to proceed. Prosecutors charged both as adults. The decision reflected the level of planning and the nature of the crime. There was no trial. In April 2023, both defendants pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Sentencing followed separate hearings. At Miller's hearing, the court reviewed the planning messages. The judge noted the length of preparation and the deliberate selection of the victim. The sentence imposed was life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years, the minimum allowed under state law for a juvenile convicted of first-degree murder. Goodale's sentencing occurred months later. The court acknowledged his cooperation and expressions of remorse. He received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 25 years. During the hearings, members of Graber's family spoke. They described her commitment to teaching and faith. They addressed the defendants directly. Some spoke about forgiveness as a personal choice. Others focused on loss. No one disputed the facts of what had happened. The school district and town responded with counseling and memorials. Classes were adjusted. Teachers addressed safety concerns. The case left a lasting mark on how educators viewed daily routines that had once felt normal. From a system perspective, the evidence was clear. Digital communication provided a record of intent. Physical evidence supported those records. The pleas removed uncertainty about responsibility. The harder questions came afterward. Both defendants were minors at the time of the crime. The law required sentences that balanced accountability with the possibility of release decades later. The court followed the statute. Some members of the public supported that outcome. Others believed the punishment did not match the harm. Graber's death was not the result of conflict outside the school. It arose directly from the classroom relationship and a grading decision that followed standard policy. No prior reports suggested a threat. No warning signs were communicated to the school or to law enforcement. The system responded only after the planning was complete. In the months that followed, appeals were filed. Both sentences were upheld. Courts found the sentencing process lawful and proportionate under existing standards for juvenile offenders. The case continues to be cited in discussions about student accountability, educator safety, and the limits of early intervention. Schools cannot monitor private messages. Teachers cannot anticipate violent intent tied to grades. Law enforcement acts on reports, not assumptions. Nohema Graber went to work and took a walk. 2 students decided to treat that routine as an opportunity. The law addressed what could be proven. It imposed sentences allowed by statute. It did not change the conditions that made the act possible. What should have happened differently before planning moved from messages to action? Case 10. Alexander Ken Jackson. This case did not begin with a search or a report from a neighbor. It began with a phone call placed by the person later charged with the killings. On the morning of June 15, 2021, emergency dispatch in Cedar Rapids received a call from a young man who said his family had been shot during a break-in. He described an intruder. He reported his own injury. Officers were sent to a house on Oak Leaf Court. Inside, they found 3 people dead, Jan Jackson was 61 years old. He was the father. Melissa Jackson was 68. She was the mother. Their daughter, Sabrina, was 19. She had recently graduated from high school and was enrolled at the University of Iowa. She played the oboe and was active in school and community programs. The family had lived in the home for several years. There were no prior calls for service at the address. Alexander Ken Jackson was 20 years old. He lived in the home. He had graduated from high school with honors and was attending college. He had no criminal record. He told officers that a masked man entered the house and opened fire. The scene did not support that account. There was no forced entry. Nothing had been taken. No doors or windows were damaged. Neighbors' cameras showed no unknown person entering or leaving the area. A .22 caliber rifle belonging to the family was recovered. Alexander's palm prints were found on it. The weapon required a specific loading process familiar to members of the household. Medical findings showed each victim had been shot multiple times. The wounds were consistent with close-range firing inside the home. Investigators noted the placement of the victims, and the sequence of shots suggested intentional targeting rather than random gunfire. Alexander had a gunshot wound to his foot. Medical review later showed the injury was self-inflicted. Investigators interviewed Alexander at the hospital. He maintained the intruder story. He gave a general description of a suspect that did not match any evidence. He acknowledged tension at home over expectations. His father had recently told him to find a job or move out. The investigation focused on verifiable facts. Phone data showed Alexander was home. Surveillance footage showed no one else arriving. Forensic testing tied the rifle to the victims and to Alexander. No evidence supported the presence of an outside offender. Alexander was arrested the same day. At trial, prosecutors presented a case built on physical evidence and contradictions in Alexander's account. They argued the shootings were staged to appear as a home invasion. They described the motive as avoidance of responsibility and consequences following conflict with his parents. The defense argued the case relied on inference. They pointed to the lack of eyewitnesses. They suggested an intruder could have entered without detection. They challenged whether motive alone could support conviction. Jurors reviewed body camera footage, forensic reports, and the recorded emergency call. They heard testimony about the rifle and the loading mechanism. They heard about the absence of any supporting evidence for an intruder. After deliberation, the jury found Alexander guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. At sentencing, the court imposed 3 life sentences to be served consecutively. The judge stated that each killing was a separate act and required separate accountability. Alexander declined to make a statement. Family members of the victims later released statements describing their loss and rejecting the narrative that Alexander had presented. They spoke about the harm caused not only by the deaths, but by the attempt to portray himself as another victim. The community response was marked by disbelief. Cedar Rapids had not seen a triple homicide of this kind in decades. Vigils were held. A scholarship was created in Sabrina's name. Friends and classmates shared memories focused on her future plans. From an institutional perspective, the case moved efficiently. Law enforcement secured the scene, identified inconsistencies, and relied on evidence rather than speculation. There were no claims of investigative misconduct. Appeals were filed and later denied. The convictions were upheld. The case raised questions about how violence can occur inside a family with no prior contact with the justice system. There were no reports of threats, no documented history of abuse, no formal warning signs that would have triggered intervention. The system responded only after the emergency call was made. Alexander Jackson did not dispute that his family members were dead. He disputed how it happened. The jury rejected his account. The courts affirmed that decision. 3 people lost their lives inside a home where they believed they were safe. One of them had just begun adulthood. The person responsible was part of the same household. The law addressed responsibility and imposed punishment. It did not provide an explanation that extends beyond the facts proven at trial. What should have happened differently when the only account came from the person who survived? Case 11, Annette D. Cahill. October 13th, 1992. Ended with a discovery that made no immediate sense to investigators. Late that afternoon, a young woman returned to a rural home outside West Liberty, Iowa. Inside a bedroom, she found her fiancé, Corey Lee Wieneke, dead. He was 22 years old. He had suffered severe head injuries. There was no sign of forced entry. The family dog had not reacted. The scene suggested the person responsible was someone Corey knew. Corey worked as a bartender at his family's business, Wink's Tap. He was well known in the area. He had grown up locally, played sports in school, and maintained a wide social circle. He was engaged to Jody Hotz, who lived with him. He also had relationships outside that engagement, a fact known to many people in his life. One of those relationships involved Annette D. Cahill. Cahill was older than Corey. She was married and had children. Their relationship was secret and intense. Friends later described frequent arguments and jealousy. On the night before Corey's death, witnesses saw him at a bar with another woman. There was an argument afterward. That argument would later become central to the case. When police arrived, they documented the injuries and secured the area. Corey had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object. Blood spatter was present in the bedroom. In his hand, investigators found several human hairs. Those hairs were collected but not immediately tested with modern methods. A metal baseball bat was later found on a roadway roughly a mile from the house. It appeared to have blood on it. A local news reporter came across the bat and notified authorities. At the time, there was no direct forensic link between the bat and any suspect. The investigation stalled. Cahill was interviewed early. She denied involvement. She provided shopping receipts that placed her away from the house around the time of death. She took a polygraph test and was told she showed no deception. With no physical evidence tying anyone to the killing, the case went cold. For more than 2 decades, there were no charges. Corey's family continued to believe the person responsible knew him. His mother said publicly that the dog's behavior mattered to her. The lack of forced entry mattered. But belief is not proof. The file stayed open but inactive. In 2017, the case changed because of a chance encounter. A woman named Jessica Becker, who had been a child in 1992, spoke with a state investigator while in a hospital. She told him she remembered something she had never reported. As a 9-year-old, she said she overheard Cahill crying and saying words that indicated responsibility for Corey's death. Becker described candles, emotional statements, and guilt expressed aloud. Investigators documented the statement. They reopened the case. Another witness, Scott Payne, was re-interviewed. He said he had seen Cahill burning items in a barrel days after the murder. In earlier years, he had described the items as stuff. In later interviews, he specified clothing with blood on it. Cahill was arrested in 2018, 26 years after Corey's death. The case went to trial in 2019. The first jury could not reach a verdict. The second trial proceeded months later. Jurors heard from Becker about what she said she overheard as a child. They heard from Payne about the burning barrel. They heard from law enforcement about the lack of physical evidence and the long delay. The defense focused on what was missing. No fingerprints. No DNA connecting Cahill to the bat. No eyewitness placing her at the scene. They challenged the reliability of childhood memory recalled decades later. They questioned changes in witness statements over time. The prosecution argued motive and opportunity. They argued jealousy and anger following the argument at the bar. They presented the overheard statements as admissions. They pointed to the bat and the absence of any other viable suspect. The jury convicted Annette Cahill of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison, with a mandatory minimum before parole eligibility. For Corey's family, the verdict brought a form of resolution. They had waited most of their lives for a court to address what happened. For Cahill's family, it marked the beginning of a different fight. Appeals followed. Cahill argued that the evidence was insufficient and that reliance on delayed memory violated fairness. Appellate courts reviewed the record and upheld the conviction. They found that the jury was entitled to weigh credibility and draw conclusions from the evidence presented. The case did not end there. Post-conviction filings raised new questions. DNA testing conducted years later did not identify Cahill or Corey on the baseball bat. The hairs found in Corey's hand were also subjected to renewed analysis. Those results did not conclusively identify the source. Supporters of Cahill argue the conviction rests on memory rather than science. They argue the investigation failed to pursue other suspects thoroughly in the early years. They point to the lack of forensic confirmation as a critical gap. The state argues the conviction was based on the totality of evidence, not a single test. They note that absence of DNA does not prove absence of involvement. They maintain that the jury heard all relevant facts. As of now, Cahill remains incarcerated. Additional hearings are scheduled to review claims related to evidence handling and trial strategy. The courts will decide whether any new findings alter the original judgment. This case sits at the intersection of delayed justice and evidentiary limits. It raises difficult questions about how long memories remain reliable, how cases should be evaluated when science advances after trial, and how much weight juries should place on statements made outside formal settings. Corey Wieneke was killed in his own home. The person responsible was not identified for decades. When accountability arrived, it relied on testimony rather than physical proof. Whether that is sufficient remains contested. Where should the line be drawn when time, memory, and justice collide? Case 12. Todd Michael Mullis. A farm accident was reported. Within weeks, that explanation no longer held. On November 10, 2018, work was underway on a family hog farm outside Earlville, Iowa. It was a routine day by local standards. Tasks were divided, animals were tended, equipment was moved. At some point that morning, Lynn Mullis was sent to a red shed to retrieve a pet carrier. She did not return. Amy was 39 years old. She was a mother of 3 and helped run the farm alongside her husband, Todd Michael Mullis. Friends described her as involved and capable, despite recent health issues that sometimes caused dizziness. She had undergone a medical procedure weeks earlier. That fact would become part of the first explanation offered. Todd Mullis was 42. He had worked the farm for years and was known as organized and demanding. The marriage had been strained. Amy had begun a relationship outside the marriage and had discussed leaving. Those conversations were not public at the time. When Amy did not come back from the shed, Todd sent their 13-year-old son, Tristan, to check on her. Tristan found his mother face down, with a corn rake embedded in her back. Todd arrived moments later. He removed the rake. He loaded Amy into a truck and began driving toward the hospital while calling emergency dispatch. On the call, he said she had fallen and landed on the rake. He said it was an accident. He said she had been dizzy. Amy was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. At first, the account was accepted. Farm injuries happen. Corn rakes are common tools. The scene fit a familiar narrative. Investigators documented the area and began routine review. The medical examination changed the case. The autopsy identified multiple puncture wounds with different angles and depths. The injuries could not be explained by a single fall. There were signs of blunt force trauma to the face and ear. There were injuries to Amy's hand, consistent with defensive movement. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. That ruling forced a re-evaluation of everything that came before it. Investigators returned to the farm. They reviewed timelines. Todd stated he had been working with Tristan in the hog barn during the relevant period, with only brief moments away. Tristan confirmed that account. The window of opportunity was narrow. The corn rake itself became critical. The pattern of wounds indicated more than one insertion. That meant force had been applied more than once. The accident explanation did not account for that. As investigators expanded their review, they learned about Amy's relationship with another man. Messages showed she was unhappy in the marriage. She had spoken about leaving. She had expressed fear about how Todd would react to divorce and property division. The farm was the family's livelihood. Electronic devices were examined. Searches were found on a shared tablet related to organ damage, impalement injuries, and infidelity. The timing of those searches raised questions. Todd said others used the device. Investigators documented the data. Todd was arrested in February 2019. The case went to trial later that year. The first jury did not reach a verdict. The court declared a mistrial. A second trial was scheduled. At the second trial, the state focused on 3 areas: medical findings, motive, and opportunity. The medical examiner testified that the injuries were inconsistent with an accident. The affair provided a possible reason. The timeline placed Todd as the only adult present. The defense argued the opposite. They said farm work is unpredictable. They said falls can cause complex injuries. They argued there was no blood on Todd's clothing and no direct physical evidence tying him to an attack. They challenged the interpretation of the wounds. The jury returned a guilty verdict on first-degree murder. Todd Mullis was sentenced to life in prison. Appeals followed. The defense argued that counsel had failed to consult certain experts and that the case relied too heavily on inference. Appellate courts reviewed the record and upheld the conviction. The case did not end there. Post-conviction filings raised new arguments. Additional experts were consulted who suggested alternative explanations for the injuries. They argued that the pattern could occur under specific accident conditions. Hearings were held in early 2025. The court heard testimony about trial strategy and expert access. A decision remains pending. Throughout the process, the children have remained central. One found his mother. All lost her. The legal arguments have played out over years, with public attention returning each time a hearing is scheduled. From a systems standpoint, the shift from accident to homicide demonstrates both caution and correction. Investigators did not rush to judgment. They followed medical findings when those findings contradicted the initial report. The court allowed the case to be tested by multiple juries. There are also limits. No eyewitness saw the act. No weapon bore direct forensic proof, tying Todd to use at the moment of death. The case rests on medical interpretation, motive evidence, and timing. Supporters of the conviction argue that the medical findings alone exclude accident and that opportunity points to one person. Supporters of post-conviction relief argue that when science is debated, certainty should be high before imposing the most severe sentence. Amy Mullis did not leave the farm alive that day. Her death was not the result of machinery failure or animal behavior. The court concluded it was a killing. Whether that conclusion will stand after all reviews are complete remains to be seen. When a case turns on expert interpretation rather than direct observation, where should accountability be set? 12 cases, 12 different paths into violence, different ages, motives, settings, and outcomes. What they share is not shock value or rarity. What they share is exposure of limits. Each case moved through the justice system in the way the law allows. Some ended in convictions. Some ended in death before trial. Some remain contested years later. The outcomes vary, but the structure is consistent. The system responds after harm occurs. In several cases, the warning signs were present but incomplete. In others, there were none that met the threshold for action. Some crimes unfolded inside families with no prior contact with law enforcement. Others involved institutions that relied on cooperation without sufficient protection. In more than one case, digital records preserved intent, while human intervention lagged behind. The courts answered the narrow question placed before them: guilt or innocence under statute. They did not resolve the broader questions that remain uncomfortable and unresolved. How much evidence is enough when memory replaces forensics? How much responsibility institutions carry when cooperation creates risk? How prevention is measured when behavior appears ordinary until it is not? How accountability functions when the person responsible controls the first narrative? For the victims, the record is final. Their lives ended whether the case moved quickly or took decades. For families, the process continues long after sentencing, shaped by appeals, hearings, and public debate. Justice, as applied here, followed rules. Those rules produced outcomes. Whether they produced fairness, protection, or prevention is not settled by verdicts alone. The facts have been laid out without ornament. The consequences are visible. The questions remain open. Where did accountability fail first?